Caribbeanology, huh? What is it all about? Well, I'm glad you asked. Stay tuned. When many people think of the Caribbean, they often think of this, maybe this, perhaps this, maybe this, or this, and even this. Trust me, I've heard the latter. For many others, the Caribbean is all about rum, sun, and fun. However, while true in quite a few places, the reality is, it is far more than all of that. When you look beyond those things, you find a region that is both rich in culture and history. A history that once propped up the fortunes of Western Europe. Some of those fortunes still exist today in inheritances, trust funds, lavish homes, and buildings, something I will get back to a little later in the video. While the Caribbean is often considered to be the arc of islands in the Caribbean Sea from the Bahamas down to Trinidad, the definition can get a little tricky after that. For example, no one doubts that Barbados is part of the Caribbean. However, that island sits entirely in the Atlantic Ocean and not the Caribbean Sea. But geologically speaking, it sits atop the far eastern end of the Caribbean plate, which fully props up all the other islands of the Caribbean, or in part. Trinidad, on the other hand, which does have a Caribbean coastline, is actually, geologically speaking, part of South America, as it is actually part of the South American plate. The Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos are neither in the Caribbean Sea or are part of the Caribbean plate, but for many, they are considered a part of the Caribbean. Then there is Guyana, which, like the Bahamas, is neither part of the Caribbean plate nor does it have a coastline on the Caribbean Sea. But from a socioeconomic, historical, cultural, and social standpoint, it is generally considered a part of the Caribbean, though it sits squarely on the South American continent. Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, Panama, Honduras, Costa Rica, and even Mexico do not generally spring to mind when the Caribbean is mentioned. However, each has a Caribbean Sea coastline, and along those coastlines are vibrant cultures that have deep family and historical connections to the better-known islands of the Caribbean. It is not surprising to hear English being spoken in those areas, as well as hearing reggae and soca, often more associated with the better-known islands of the Caribbean. There are even lesser-known islands in the southern Caribbean Sea, connected to some of the aforementioned Spanish-speaking countries, islands like San Andres and Providenciales, which belong to Colombia, Margarita Island, which belongs to Venezuela, and Roatan, Utila, and the Bay Islands, which belong to Honduras. Two of Mexico's popular resort cities, Cancun and Cozumel, sits on the Caribbean Sea, and next door is Belize, formerly British Honduras, which was once part of the British West Indies and has a Caribbean Sea coastline. In this regard, when we think of the Caribbean, then the definition, in my estimation, should not be as rigid as often thought. While today the Caribbean is often seen as these idyllic paradises where people go to get away or as playgrounds for the rich, the region, as mentioned earlier, is rich in history and more than just pirates. The region, first inhabited by first Americans, also referred to as Amerindians, were primarily transplanted by enslaved Africans who were enslaved and brought in to primarily work on massive sugarcane plantations scattered about the islands in the region. In places like Guyana, the earliest enslaved Africans brought into the country helped to drain the swampy coastal regions, as well as building an intricate system of dams, canals, and cocas to manage flooding. On the backs of these enslaved Africans were fortunes built back in Western Europe, whose kingdoms and empires controlled the region at the time. Places like Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, were considered one of the wealthiest pieces of real estate on earth because of the riches it produced for France through slave labor, earning it the moniker the Pearl of the Antilles. It's been said that the former British colony of Jamaica produced more wealth for England than all of its mainland American colonies combined. France, given a choice to give up its claimed lands in today's Canada or Guadeloupe, chose to keep Guadeloupe. The island of St. Lucia exchanged colonial hands between England and France 11 times. Even in relatively modern times, 1917 to be exact, the United States purchased the Danish West Indies, today's U.S. Virgin Islands, for $25 million total dollars. At the time, it was the most expensive land purchase the U.S. ever made. The purchase was for a mere 133 total square miles of land. In 1803, the U.S. purchased 820,000 square miles of land from France that would make up much of the United States for $15 million. You can do the math. The Caribbean region did not just benefit Europe. It also played a crucial and pivotal role in America's War of Independence, with the Caribbean island of St. Eustatius serving as a waypoint for munitions and other supplies from European allies of the American rebels that were smuggled to those rebels. Martinique, further to the south, was where a French fleet was launched and sent to Chesapeake Bay off the coast of today's Virginia to assist General George Washington. The arrival of that fleet, for all intents and purposes, forced the surrender of the British, effectively ending the American Revolution. This brings me to our brand, Caribbeanology. At Caribbeanology, our mission is to highlight the Caribbean and present a fresh understanding of the region's culture and history and all-around awesomeness. We desire to go above and beyond the typical tourism magazines and websites, which often tell a cursory history, oftentimes starting with Columbus discovered, and some passing mention of the culture, to move on to sell an image of paradise to draw potential customers to the idyllic vision of white sand beaches and daiquiri sipping. In addition, we seek to make the Caribbean more relevant and interesting. If, as a viewer, you say at the end of our videos, "Wow, I didn't know that," the videos were not in vain. So thank you for coming on this journey with us to become a Caribbeanologist.